Okay, I think we'll kick off because we've got a lot to go through, and we are recording, so we can share this later with anyone who arrives after this. So, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome back to those of you who joined us for the first webinar on the release of the Land Sector Removal Standard back in February. We're excited at this new opportunity to talk to you about this area. Hopefully shed a little bit of light on the new document. I said in the original webinar that the LSRS is a long and complex document, and we won't be able to cover all of it in detail. That is doubly true for the LSRG, which doubles or more the length of it. So once again, we've tried to focus on specific issues and what we think are the initial priorities, and hope that provides some real tangible information of use to all of you. We've once again structured the webinar in 3 sections. We're going to spend a little bit of time setting the scene and doing a brief refresh of what's in the LSRS itself and the sort of key topics there that we will then build upon in terms of what's come out in the guidance. And then we'll go into some deep dives of a few key issues we've picked out that we think is useful to talk about at more length, what the guidance does say, what it doesn't say about those areas, and then a little bit on next steps, what it means in practice, what's happening more widely that might influence how you approach the LSRS. Once again, we've assumed a baseline familiarity with the topic just so that we can get a little bit more into it and a little bit more technical in hopes that that's useful. So that's the level we're aiming for here. So over the next few slides, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time introducing ourselves, what our background is and experience on this subject, particularly so you know what perspective we're bringing to this and what experience we have that is, sort of influencing our interpretation of the guidance and the standards. So we are 3Keel. We're a sustainability consultancy based in the UK, but working globally, primarily in FMCG and natural resource supply chains, so land-based supply chains. We have significant climate expertise. We do lots of supporting organizations on understanding climate risk, setting net zero targets, SBTi validated targets, and developing decarbonization strategies. We're global leaders in commodities and deforestation. We manage a number of large and complex programs that seek to improve traceability in these commodity supply chains and also support on deforestation target setting and achievement. And finally, we have significant practical experience on the ground in agriculture and supply chains. And our teams in this area focus on action and implementation. So once you've understood your risk, you've set your targets, how do you go about actually doing it on the ground and then claiming and reporting those outcomes? So we try and bring our expertise across all of these areas to everything that we do.
Catherine, sorry, can I just chime in for 1 sec? We've had one attendee say that there's an echo with your audio. That's not coming through for me, but if others could just write into the Q&A and chat if they're experiencing that issue too, and if so, we'll get it resolved. But
okay,
not
thank you.
No problem. We have had in the past where people join Zoom through online and another system. So everyone else is saying it's okay. Okay, all good.
Okay. Thank you. So agriculture and landscapes, just to get into that a bit. So some specific experience that we're bringing to this is past work we've done exploring what it means to be doing this type of work, removals, insetting in a high integrity fashion. We've done this with Conservation International and also the UK government. We do this practically for a number of clients looking to implement and report removals through their supply chain. We're also exploring this practically through our LENS program, where we actively implement insetting and reporting through Scope 3 and other projects such as working with WWF on a pilot of insetting in Cerrado soy. So today, here today at the webinar, you have myself. I'm Catherine McCosker. I am the head of agriculture and landscapes. I have a practical background in agriculture myself. Megan MacGillivray, who is a senior consultant in the Ag and Land team, is joining us, and she has delivered a lot of our projects in this area. And then we have Owen Smith, who is a colleague of ours in the climate, nature, and resources area, and she has a lot of expertise in science-based targets, the flag sector, and that sort of thing, and she'll be facilitating our Q&A for us later. So finally, before we start getting into it about this webinar, so our aim here today is to help you to understand how to use the LSRG, how to navigate it, and to bring into the light some of the key topics and issues. We're not going to do any sort of criteria by criteria or requirement by requirement review. There's too much in there. We're also not going to do things like go into deep technical coverage on geologic and technical storage or biogenic product emissions, though we will talk about those briefly. Our focus is really on land management and land production emissions and removals, just because that's where we think we have the most value and experience to add. We'll talk about key themes and challenges and our views on what matter most. We are recording this webinar, so we will share the recording and the slides afterwards. And there will be a Q&A at the end. So please do use the Zoom Q&A function to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can do this anonymously if you prefer, and then Owen will help us collate and facilitate those at the end. So moving on, setting the scene. So where are we now? How did we get here? And let's remind ourselves a bit about the standard itself. So most of you are probably well aware of this, but just to set the scene, there are two organizations, key organizations that sort of set the rules, dictate the rules for corporate climate targets. Those are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which defines the rules for corporate accounting and reporting. And they have a number of standards that are relevant to different sectors. The ones that are most relevant to the land-based sector are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 standard, which is the corporate value chain standard, and this one, the new land sector and removals standard. And then you have the Science-Based Targets Organization initiative, which defines corporate greenhouse gas target setting and defines the scale of emissions and reductions and removals that are needed to achieve or be aligned with Paris goals. And they rely on each other. The SBTI largely defers to the GHGP for detailed accounting guidance, but they are meant to be in alignment and complementary to each other. So now I'm going to spend a couple of slides just reminding ourselves of what's in the LSRS itself to allow us to sort of go more deeply into the guidance after. So the LSRS is split into two reporting categories. They have the physical inventory, which is the core emissions and removals numbers that are aligned to conventional corporate reporting. And then you have additional accounting categories, and this includes a mixture of emissions and other novel metrics, such as land occupation and land carbon leakage, which we'll go into more detail on. You are asked to report this in a combined greenhouse gas report, which also gives space to provide justification for the choices that you've made and your alignment with the LSRS. And that is actually genuinely important because there are a lot of places where the standard is open to interpretation and you need to provide your reasoning for why you think your approach is aligned. Assurance is not required, but it is recommended, and it would be against this entire report. The key topics that we talked about in our previous webinar and still relevant that the LSRS provides requirements and clarity around are land use change accounting. So there's a lot more clarity on best practice for calculating land use change emissions. This is even more so true in the guidance, which provides a lot of calculation guidance. It also provides a sort of route to potentially reflect deforestation and conversion-free policies and controls, such as certification in your greenhouse gas inventory. There's more information on land management emissions, confirmation that they're asking for a stock change accounting approach, that they're looking to separate biogenic and production land management emissions, and they provide a number of recommendations for how you allocate these emissions. There's some new metrics, land occupation and land carbon leakage, the latter of which you are only required to report if you are conducting certain what they call high leakage risk activities. It goes into greenhouse gas credits and how to deal with those, primarily credits that are generated within your Scope 3 boundaries, spatial boundaries. They say that only those credits are within scope, and they differentiate between inset credits and greenhouse gas credits, but they do have quite a lot of additional quality criteria that those credits should be meeting. And then, of course, the LSRS excludes, there's an exclusion for forestry, and there's quite a lot of other lands that get sort of caught up in this exclusion, and we're going to go into that in more detail. So where you see the stars, we're going to go into more detail on the guidance on that. The last thing just to touch on is traceability and spatial boundaries. It's worth mentioning in this recap just because it is so fundamental to land-based carbon accounting and to how the LSRS sees land-based carbon accounting. So you have to define a spatial boundary for your accounting. The LSRS gives 5 different spatial boundaries. They define them, they order them from least precise to most precise. They give guidance on when you might choose which boundary and generally push you towards the most precise option that is available to you, and then moving to be more and more precise as time goes on. There are rules about that you have to be consistent in your spatial boundary for emissions and removals and for the same volume of crop that is coming from the same spatial boundary. You need physical traceability in order to account or use a spatial boundary, define a spatial boundary at sourcing region or below. The main way that they ask you to prove this physical traceability is through a chain of custody model, which could be certified or it could be an internal system. So that is the sort of recap of the key topics of the LSRS, and we covered those. You can always go back to our old webinar to go into that. And now I'll hand over to Megan to say, so what about the guidance and where that brings us?
Thanks, Catherine. So following the publication of the land sector removal standard in January, I guess the next question is, where are we now? So at the start of this month, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol launched the land sector removals guidance, which provides additional guidance and clarification on aligning with the requirements that are nested within the land sector removal standard. Alongside the guidance, the version 1.1 of the land sector removal standard was published, but this just contains kind of administrative and non-substantive changes and clarifications. The key other thing to note is that the standard kind of comes into force on the 1st of January 2027. So after that point, organisations that are looking to align with the Greenhouse Gas Corporate Standard and Scope 3 standard, who do have those significant land-based activities, will also need to apply the land sector removal standard requirements, and any claims of kind of alignment to the land sector removal standard you will need to demonstrate that you have complied with all of those requirements. The land sector removal standard we expect will kind of continue to evolve, and there is a current request for information on forestry accounting to support the development of future positions on this. And additionally, as we'll explore towards the end of today's session, there are also a few other relevant work streams that are ongoing under both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Targets Initiative that might offer more routes to reporting impacts of land-based mitigation activities outside of that physical greenhouse gas inventory that Catherine was just talking about. So what is the land sector removals guidance? It kind of mirrors and builds on the contents of the land sector removal standard. So all of the requirements and recommendations that are within the land sector removal standard are duplicated within the land sector removals guidance. So although it's more than 500 pages long, not all of those are new. So on top of the requirements and recommendations that were already published within the standard, the guidance provides, I guess, like additional information and on implementing the requirements and recommendations. So that could be like useful information in some places on the context or rationale behind the recommendations and requirements that helps you understand why you need to do that. And also shows specific case studies of how organisations have applied those requirements within their own supply chain contexts. One thing that I find particularly useful is kind of decision trees within the guidance that show how you could or should select different methods and data sources. For example, when you might be looking to use primary data versus secondary data. And within the guidance, there's also kind of useful calculations and equations for particular accounting challenges. So it is, a massive document. And we feel that the most useful way to approach is to kind of pick it up and use it when necessary to supplement the land sector removal standard. So if you've got, a particular question or topic in the land sector removal standard that you want more information on. So reflecting the scale of the document, it's much too big to get through meaningfully in the hour that we have today. So we thought it'd be most useful to explore a few key issues and scenarios where the land sector removals guidance has the most to say and where there's like the biggest potential impacts for organisational activities. So we're going to move now into exploring 4 key topics with you today, and then think about the broader picture of what this might mean for you and your organisation. So the first topic that we'll explore is one of those key accounting categories that Catherine spoke about earlier. So that's land use change emissions, which you can see here in the kind of orange box. And it is one of the key categories within that overall reporting structure. And land use change, it's a really complicated category of emissions to account for, but it's also really important. And, for deforestation risk commodities such as palm or soy, land use change is the biggest contributor to those emissions. So it's really important to get right. The standard and the accompanying guidance have provided useful clarification about how to account for land use change emissions. And I guess previously, before the standard, there was a lot of variation in the methodology for calculating these emissions. So 3 key points kind of stand out to us when we're thinking about calculating land use change emissions. The first is the assessment period. So if you take any given agricultural product, over what time period do you have to assess whether there has been any land use change on the land that's used to produce that product? So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol requires that period's 20 years. And then the guidance actually further clarifies that for products that might have a cultivation or rotation period that is more than 20 years, that longer period should be used as a land use change assessment period. And that is actually really important for commodities like palm, where that cultivation period is likely to be longer than 20 years. But we also feel like this is kind of a potential risk of misalignment because few data sources, we think, will be applying that kind of longer assessment period that's stated within the guidance. The second key consideration is the discounting approach. So once you've identified any land use changes within the last 20 years, the emissions then need to be spread over the following years. And that kind of reflects that land use change emissions don't happen the instant you convert the land, but over kind of several years following the conversion event. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol requires those emissions to be linearly discounted over the following 20 years. So what that means is that most emissions are allocated to the years that are directly after the conversion event, with decreasing amounts the further away you get from the event. And the guidance provides some really useful worked examples on this, particularly around kind of showing how the calculations would add up if there have been multiple land use change events within that 20-year assessment period. And then the final thing to call out here is the calculation approach. So there are various ways of calculating land use change emissions depending on the information you have about the land. And that ranges from statistical to direct land use change calculations. And that methodology used also depends on the spatial boundary applied, as you can see in the table. So when we're thinking about land use change and particularly deforestation, organisations are most often going to look to address these impacts within their supply chains by sourcing deforestation-free certified products. And the guidance talks about this in a lot more detail than standard did. So there's 2 key things that we'd like to call out here when we're thinking about whether sourcing of deforestation and conversion-free certified products could lead to accounting for lower land use change emissions. The first is going back to that question about the assessment period. So certifications apply a cutoff date. So after that point, there must be no land use change, and then that product counts as deforestation and conversion free. However, the cutoff date's not always aligned with the 20-year accounting window for land use change emissions. So take an example of a certification that has a cutoff date of 2016. So that's 10 years ago. And that would count as DCF, but not automatically as zero land use change emissions, as you've got that kind of additional 10 years between 2006 and 2016 that need to be accounted for. And unfortunately, the guidance doesn't provide that much information about how you would actually account for land use change emissions when only part of the assessment period can be proved to be zero deforestation. So the next point to pull out is around the calculation approach. And as Catherine said, the spatial boundary of accounting basically underpins everything within the land sector removal standard, including the methods you'd use to calculate emissions. And that's impacted by traceability. And when you think about kind of certification, the land sector removals guidance and standard allow multiple different chains of custody to prove traceability. So you can use mass balance under certain conditions. You can always use segregated and identity preserved chains of custody to prove that traceability. But the other key thing to consider is that a specific chain of custody can be used to demonstrate traceability to different spatial boundaries. So an example of this is sourcing mass balance certified palm oil, where you could have alongside your mass balance model traceability to a mill, where you know that you're sourcing from a specific mill, but you might not have visibility of the specific plantations that are supplying into that mill. And at that level of traceability, you'd need to apply the sourcing region spatial boundary and account for land use change emissions across all of the attributable productive lands that could potentially supply into that mill. Whereas with that same mass balance model, you could actually have traceability to the plantation, so all the way back to the land management unit that supplied your products. And then in that case, you'd be able to calculate direct land use change emissions on those certified productive plantations, making it a lot easier to account for those lower land use change emissions.
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself there. Thanks, Megan. So just zooming back out and back into a different category, we're going to talk about removals for a while now, because the guidance does have quite a lot to say about removals. So I'll talk about the accounting side of things first. So on the data side, the guidance does have a lot of information, clarification, examples, tables, useful tables on data quality, what counts, what doesn't count. It's not exhaustive, so there are still sort of gray areas, but there is a lot there. One of the things that the standard did, the final standard, in terms of updating from the original draft, is it moved from talking about primary data to empirical data required for reporting removals. The guidance still discusses primary and secondary data and gives good examples of each of those, but it specifies that it's empirical data that is specific to the spatial boundary, so specific to the sinks and sources that you are reporting, is required for reporting removals. There is a lot of data quality guidance in there as well, in terms of what you're looking for and temporal qualities, spatial qualities, that sort of thing. The guidance also goes into uncertainty quite a lot more. So another change from draft to standard is that they removed the requirement for statistical significance being required to report removals. They have retained it as a recommendation. And instead, you are asked to report on uncertainty. You are not asked to meet any specific, there are no specific requirements on how much uncertainty you could have or what that uncertainty should look like. But they do ask you to report it, and they ask you to report it in three ways or three types of uncertainty. So they want you to report uncertainty, to propagate out uncertainty from the input data, the activity data, or the measurement data that's going in to your reporting. They want you to determine your confidence interval and report that. And they also require you to select, quote unquote, select a conservative value from that range. They're not sort of prescriptive on that, but they do give an example where a conservative estimate that is lower than both the mean and median in the uncertainty range would be a good way to select a conservative value, for example, or to imply an uncertainty deduction to justify a removals value. So there is a bit more, there are more examples in how you might do that and what they're looking for. In some of those examples, they also talk about statistical significance, which does remain as a recommendation. And they give some examples of where uncertainty estimates might signify land's carbon stock increases are not significant. And then they say you should not be reporting those if that's true. So it's not required, but they're definitely very much not wanting you to report them if possible, if they're not statistically significant. Of course, that requires a certain level of data and data analysis that might not always be possible. So it is a consideration. Finally, in terms of the methodologies that you use, so the IPCC, just to give a bit of background, uses a tier structure to describe and provide a hierarchy for methodologies for carbon accounting, and they have tiers 1 through 3. Tier 1 is the most simple method. It's usually global or regional estimates, large uncertainty ranges. Tier 2 is sort of in the middle, intermediate complexity. It might involve country-specific or management-specific data. And then tier 3 is the most precise, I suppose, and it requires more intensive data collection, it requires empirical data, and it can lead to more accurate estimates with reduced uncertainty ranges. So the LSRS does not actually explicitly require tier 3 for removals reporting, but it implicitly requires it. I mean, you can't not use a tier 3 because of the requirement for empirical data, which sort of lifts you up into that tier 3 methodology. It also sort of implicitly recommends it in various ways. It will call out in its examples when a certain tool or method is likely to be tier 1 or tier 2 as a sort of cautionary watch out. If you're wanting to report removals, these are going to be less acceptable. And they also specify that tier 1 and tier methodologies are acceptable if you're only looking to report net soil carbon stock changes, maybe zero out your emissions and not actually report removals, then the bar is a bit lower. There is also a lot of information about calculation approaches. So they go into factor-based, remote sensing, modeling, direct measurement. There are examples for all of these. There are definitions, there are advantages and disadvantages. So there is a lot of useful clarification in there. I would say not so much that there aren't still some gray areas on what counts as empirical data. For example, particularly when we're talking about soil carbon and soil carbon modeling and measuring. In reality, you are most likely to be using a hybrid approach when you're reporting removals. Calculation approaches are more scalable, they're generally more cost-effective, cost-efficient, but they require calibration with empirical data. Often they talk about just direct measurement data. You need direct measurement data to calibrate those. And so you'll need to do some direct measurement for that, but direct measurement as a standalone option is not going to be efficient, it's not going to be scalable. And then they do also talk a little bit about model and remote sensing validation, which the standard didn't talk about. And all that they say about that is that it is good practice to validate, sort of 5 years on. They ask you to recalibrate every 5 years, but you can also validate post hoc. And to use a separate data set in that validation than you do with calibration, which might be a new soil sample data set, for example. The image here is in one of the case studies. There are some genuinely useful case studies in the LSRS. This one is about how they are laddering up accounting and reporting for removals. So I'd recommend you take a look at those. On the next slide, I want to talk about the forestry exclusion, because the guidance does provide a little bit more information here. So if you remember, the version 1.1 of the LSRS does not apply to forestry. They were unable to resolve some issues around how to account for anthropogenic emissions. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of other lands that get caught up in this exclusion, most of which we knew about from the standard. The biggest one is the idea of adjacent and proximate and adjacent non-productive lands, which will be things like, small woodlands, small wetlands, but also hedgerows, buffer strips, the things you might want to see in a sort of resilient, larger land management unit. It was unclear on the topic of agroforestry systems. The box that excludes forestry in the standard calls out agroforestry as a productive land type and sort of alludes to the fact that that is potentially still includable. But they really sort of double down on this idea of productive land is in scope, non-productive land is not. And the guidance goes into a bit more detail and splits agroforestry systems into productive land and non-productive land. And non-productive land and agroforestry systems are the trees, basically, and hedgerows if they're included. So any land that is not directly producing the crop that the reporting company is acquiring. So this could be, the trees in a silvopasture system, trees in an alley cropping system. It could be even the shade trees in a canopy system for coffee, for example. So that was a bit disappointing, probably more than a bit disappointing for us, where we thought there was maybe, agroforestry was maybe going to still be in, because we see with these exclusions, quite a lot of perverse incentive to move away from, I think, the types of systems that are ultimately going to be the best for climate mitigation and adaptation. The last thing that I want to say about removals is just on the topic of the requirements around permanence and ongoing storage monitoring. They elaborate on the option that they provide around a storage monitoring framework. They give a good example. You can see it there in the image of what that might look like. And they also have a discussion on alternate approaches, accounting approaches for managing the fact that, and acknowledging the fact that permanence is an inherent issue with biogenic removals, but they are still really important as a way, particularly to, quote unquote, buy time as we are reducing emissions. So another way to do this that is used in certain circumstances is dynamic carbon accounting, which aim to measure the impact of removing CO2, temporarily storing that or delaying the emission of it, and by estimating the impacts within a selected time horizon. So a sort of a discounting approach, essentially. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol feels that it is important that a physical inventory provides information on the, like, full information and transparency on the durability and timing of removals and emissions. And they feel that a storage monitoring framework is a better way to do that and allow you to acknowledge and plan your approach for less durable removals while still accurately representing your contributions to cumulative carbon dioxide emissions and long-term temperature changes. So they give sort of justification for their choice of this, and they're sort of disallowing the other methods. And then an example of how to do this, which is just basically planning for, the fact that you might be looking at reversals upcoming and how you want to deal with that with your larger decarbonization plan and roadmap. So now I'm going to leave removals and touch briefly on the additional metrics topic, just because I think there is some interesting sort of clarification that the guidance does give. So I'll talk about land occupation first. This is a pretty straightforward calculation. They give the guidance on how to do it. There's a couple of options, statistical or direct, depending on the data you have access to. They recommend you do a 3-year rolling average just to account for, yield fluctuation and that sort of thing. They do include a recommendation to set a target on reduction, which can either be absolute or intensity based, which we just thought was interesting as a sort of yet another target that they're looking for, but it is just a recommendation. It is not a requirement. On leakage, you may know or remember that they've introduced a metric that they're calling the carbon opportunity cost of production, which is essentially carbon leakage. And they have a few things to say about this. There are 3 activities that trigger your need to report this. So not everybody needs to report this. One of those is the production of feedstock for biofuels, and that's sort of non-negotiable. If you're doing that, you have to report this. The other 2 are essentially what you could call regen ag activities or removal activities. So production management activities that result in a significant reduction in yield, or removals activities that result in a significant reduction in yield. They don't define significant, but I think there's, generally good understanding on the idea of significance. However, for those latter 2 activities, you do not need to report this metric if those activities are conducted for the purpose of improving the long-term sustainability of food production. I had hoped the guidance might shed a little light on this, but it doesn't. It's silent on the matter. There's no further information on what that means or how you justify it or prove it. So it's very much open to your interpretation. I think the fact that most of the people who will be looking to apply this standard and align with it are first and foremost looking to procure foodstuffs and crops means that is still the primary driver. And so significant reductions in yield in the first place are not generally desired in the wider system. And secondly, the moves that they will be making to do that are to improve the long-term resilience of their supply chains. So we expect to see a lot of justification in this space. Finally, very quickly, they do talk about indirect land use change, which is another metric for calculating leakage, and it's quite common in certain certifications and programs. They say that, this is a perfectly fine metric. Essentially, you can calculate this and report it alongside, but not in place of the carbon opportunity cost. The reason for that is that the ILUC approach considers not just sort of the really straightforward one-to-one emissions conversion of displacing land production and the sort of indirect land use change as a result of that. But it also it models the effect of like potential market remediation for that, rebound effects, that sort of thing, which in some ways might be more accurate, but means that the approaches can be less standardized and less interoperable. So they wanted a straightforward metric that was sort of comparable across reporting. And now I think I'm going to hand over to Megan for our last deep dive topic.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so the final topic that we're exploring is around allocation. So I've put a big box here because it can apply across any of the accounting categories. And allocation is just the process by which impacts, so that could be, emissions, removals, or even the land occupation metric that Catherine was just talking about, how those impacts are split between different products. So that could be products produced on the same bit of land within a rotation, or maybe also between co-products of a manufacturing process. So the land sector removals standard and guidance provide useful information about how to allocate emissions at the lands. So this is kind of a new concept, but really recognises the difference between typical allocation approaches you might apply for, like, for example, manufacturing processes where economic or physical mass-based allocations are favoured, with allocation processes that you might need for agricultural systems, where actually the dynamics of land use and the crops that are produced on that piece of land will really impact the emissions and the outcomes associated with that piece of land. So the guidance introduces a new form of allocation, which is known as area time allocation. So that splits emissions between products that are produced on that same parcel of land by the occupancy and time spent in the ground. And we think that's just a particularly useful thing to call out for splitting emissions and removals, where you are thinking about how can you allocate, those outcomes between crops within a rotation. It's also useful to pull out because land sector removal standard have kind of stood by this approach of requiring you to split outcomes across all crops within a rotation. So even if a funder might be funding a regenerative agriculture project for just one crop within a wider rotation, those outcomes still need to be split between all of the crops within that rotation. So with that kind of wraps up our deep dives, and I'll hand back over to Catherine to talk about some of the next steps.
Thanks, Megan. So in terms of key takeaways, the land sector and removals standard and guidance, we said this the first time, it does provide, in general, much needed clarity where there was a big gap in accounting rules in the land-based sector. It is very complex, it's very long, and the guidance, whilst it adds no new requirements as expected, it does provide a lot of examples, a lot of information. So, there is more welcome clarity in there, but there are still quite a few areas that are open to interpretation, which is not unexpected, but, I think it may be frustrating in certain areas for those who are looking to align. There are important guardrails in it to ensure robustness. That's the sort of greenhouse gas protocols watch out here. They want to ensure that anything that corporates are reporting around emissions or removals is as robust and accurate as possible, so that we have as clear a picture as possible or not if we are moving towards the Paris goals, essentially. That does mean it's a really high bar for alignment, though. And alignment, is going to be more difficult in certain supply chains and regions than others. And some it may be so difficult that we need to look at other ways to understand and report impact. Prioritization is going to be key for alignment, tackling certain things first, making a stepped plan towards alignment. We listed some priorities in our first webinar in February after the publication of the standard, and would stand by those. If you're interested in that, you can go back to that. It's on our website. There are overall themes of continuous improvement and increased transparency, pushing people to get better over time. Alignment is going to be challenging in many contexts and supply chains. In certain places, with the forestry exclusion, the adjacent proximate lands and that sort of thing, we think there's actually, some disincentives for the kind of whole farm and landscape action that is really needed to address climate mitigation and wider business needs. And so ensuring that wider business needs for this action, such as resilient supply chains, sustainable long-term supply chains, continue to be primary drivers for action. And it's not all about, scope 3 claims, which we do know is easier said than done at times. In terms of the next steps, or sort of where it goes from here, I'll talk a bit about the timeline, and then Megan will come in a bit about the wider horizon of landscape. So the effective date, as Megan mentioned earlier, is the 1st of January 2027. So to claim alignment at that point, greenhouse gas, really, I think our view is to align, even if you're looking to align with the corporate standard and the scope 3 standard. If you have significant land-based emissions, you're also going to need to comply with the LSRS. Any claims of alignment will need to comply with these requirements. We've had a lot of people come and talk to us. A lot of our clients are working towards alignment, but their data and methodologies for the 2026 year are not in alignment. Which means that when you're reporting from 2027, it just may mean that, you have to say, we've aligned as far as possible, but these are areas where we're moving into alignment this year. In terms of implications for flag targets, obviously those need to be revalidated if application of new methods compromises, quote unquote, an existing target. We think this is a low risk for flag sector pathways targets where you have absolute percent reduction. But if you have a flag commodity target, which is intensity based, then it is likely to be compromised if the mix of removals and land use change is different to the one you had in your base year, and then you may be looking at revalidation. So that's aligned with the LSRS, and then there is wider movement in the standards space.
Thanks, Catherine. So yeah, at the start of the webinar, we kind of outlined how the land sector removal standard sits within that wider landscape of kind of various standards, guidance, and target setting frameworks. So one of those key frameworks is the Science Based Targets Initiative, who rely on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for dictating the accounting rules that their targets rely on. And alongside the updates to the land sector removal standard and guidance, it's also important to reflect on the fact that the Science Based Targets Initiative, particularly their corporate greenhouse gas target setting framework, is also evolving. So in June, the SBTi launched the new corporate net zero standard. So it's called the version 2. And that contains some really significant changes and updates, with changes impacting, the target setting process, the implementation process, and also how progress against those targets is assessed. And although kind of sector-specific standards like FLAG, which are most relevant for their land-based activities, those haven't yet been updated, we do think it's likely that those standards will continue to evolve, and particularly evolve in line with the direction that's being taken under the Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2. So what are some of those key changes and kind of directions of travel? The first is around the Scope 3 target. So that used to just take the form of a kind of percentage reduction in either footprint if you're using the sector approach, or intensity if you're taking the commodity pathway. But now there are requirements to include any emissions that comprise more than 5% of the footprint. So that could bring, say, increased scrutiny on specific land-based emission sources. But there's also a much wider choice of targets that you could apply. So you still have your typical absolute reduction activity target, but now you could also prove progress using supplier alignment targets or category-specific targets. So dig into that a little bit more. Under the first version of SBTi, the only actions that were recognised as progress against your target were called activity level actions. So that's actions that directly target a company's emissions or activities that cause emissions. But SBTi is now also looking to recognise 2 forms of additional activities. So that's the activity pool level. So that could be activities within your supply shed where you might not have traceability all the way back to the farm, but you know that you're sourcing from a specific sourcing region. Or even, sector level activities, such as purchasing credits. So that includes the recognition of market-based instruments, which is a really big departure from previous approaches. And they do specify kind of quality criteria that do have to be used if you are using market-based instruments. And finally, under the Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2, there's increasing recognition of OER, which is ongoing emissions responsibility. And that basically means you have to take responsibility for any unabated emissions in the run-up to your net zero target year. So there's a lot of different approaches that count here. So that could be purchasing carbon credits, but it could also be investments in broader kind of activities such as mitigation or adaptation projects that have not yet delivered kind of quantified carbon outcomes. And so OER activities are voluntary for now, but credits will be required from 2035 onwards for those large organisations. So all of these different points kind of point to the increased recognition of organisational activities outside of the physical greenhouse gas inventory. And we know, as Catherine said, that full LSRS alignment is very difficult. And in some places, because of the physical traceability requirements, that might mean that actions that you're taking within your supply chain, so that could be investments in landscape initiatives, investments in regen ag, those can't be fully recognised within the physical inventory. But there are more and more pathways emerging that would allow that to be reported outside of the inventory and still count towards target progress.
Thanks, Megan. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. Just to wrap up, just a reminder that we spend quite a lot of our working life thinking about and talking about and working with clients to implement and align with the LSRS. So if you have further questions or you think you might need support, please do get in touch. Also, we do regularly run webinars if you want to go to the next slide, Megan, on topics that we think are interesting, that we have something to say about, that we want to help shed some light on. We've recently done a bigger one on the corporate net zero standard. Alwyn was a part of a few weeks ago. That is available on our website if you'd like to look back at that. And then just do follow us to see, what will be coming up next. And with that, I will hand over to Alwyn.
Great. Thank you, Catherine and Megan. Lots of interesting information there to digest. And we've had plenty of questions coming through in the Q&A. So I've been busy grouping those in the background into common themes and topics. And I'll kick off with one that came up a handful of times here regarding soil sampling. So I think, Catherine, I'll probably direct this to you. There's a couple of questions that are just explicitly asking to clarify whether the empirical data approach necessitates soil samples. So could you clarify that point?
Yeah, it is a very good question because the guidance talks about it so much, and yet you can still come away feeling like you're not really sure. So empirical data can include lots of different things. It just needs to be data that is taken, from measurement from real life. That could include activity data such as production data from a farm around how much petrol they've used or how many times they've tilled or that sort of thing, that type of activity data. Soil sampling data, direct measurement data, is another form of empirical data. So at times they require empirical data for reporting removals. And they do say that, good models, biogeochemical models, for example, or good, remote sensing models can achieve sort of the level of providing empirical data if they are properly calibrated to the source and the sink. And so I think that is the sort of key point there, because when they talk about calibration, they often talk about direct measurement, which in turn means soil sampling. They do say that the empirical data or the direct measurement data doesn't have to be collected by the reporting company, but it does have to be relevant to the source and sink, and it does have to meet data quality guidelines, including guidelines like around temporal requirements. So it has to be regionally relevant and within a recent time period, for example, or a relevant time period. So you could use third-party data sets, you could use academic data sets, national or regional data sets, but they have to achieve those other criteria as well. And so I think often you are just still coming back to doing the soil sampling. They stop short of saying you have to soil sample, but they talk enough times about direct measurement and sampling approaches and calibration that I think that is what is required, whether or not you're doing it or using other data sets. I think that's also why they talk about the difference between calibration and validation, which again is not a requirement. But if you're calibrating with one data set, you should be validating it with a different one, which is, probably the example they have in mind is if you're using an academic, a really good soil database for your calibration, and then you are validating that with direct measurement or like direct soil sampling. I hope that answers it. It's not super clear in the guidance, but that is our interpretation. And I think that's, the way it will be interpreted.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how that plays out in practice, and it tees up the other related question from Paul here, which is whether you have concerns about low rigor models drastically overestimating removals, because if there is this lack of clarity on the guidance and how to validate a model, the fact that the empirical data is loosely defined and the uncertainty deduction isn't required. So that would mean it's not defending against over-crediting if being used through the VCM. So yeah, interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, completely. I mean, we have all of those thoughts as well. I mean, we're helping some clients figure out, what they're comfortable with around uncertainty, whether or not this idea that you have to report uncertainty is going to have any effect in terms of ensuring that uncertainty is low, I think remains to be seen. I think we're going to have to see what emerges as best practice. I think there's going to be some element of sort of peer pressure and converging around what the wider sector feels is acceptable for uncertainty levels. And I think, it's a bit, remains to be seen. I think there is a risk of that, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Catherine. Megan, the next couple will be over to you along the topic of land use change. So the first one is saying, how to eliminate land use change within an emissions factor, like what requirements would be for that isn't yet answered, as you mentioned, particularly where there's a partial coverage across the 20-year period. And so the attendee here is asking if there are other initiatives that are addressing this topic or problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And yeah, as we've said, it isn't completely answered within the guidance. I think when you're thinking about specific types of land use change accounting, like direct land use change or kind of jurisdictional land use change, where you do have visibility of the lands, it is a bit clearer how you would account for those land use change impacts. So, for example, if you're calculating direct land use change for that plantation, because you have visibility of the land use over the last 20 years, you kind of know that you just need to be looking for land use change within those kind of 10 years that aren't covered by certification. So that's a little bit clearer. But yeah, for statistical land use change or where there is less good visibility of the lands that are producing your products, it is really difficult to account for that certification. And I think one of the key ways that we see kind of like the sector tackling this is the development of like more granular and more reliable jurisdictional or spatial emissions factors for land use change. And I think this is really supported by, like better remote sensing systems, better traceability and like view of what types of crops are being produced on which lands. So for an example, I guess like an organization that we work with a lot is Ad Astra, and their Orbay platform is looking to really track for specific commodities and even specific sourcing regions what might be the most accurate land use change figure. And that will obviously account for kind of certification, particularly when you're looking at kind of jurisdictional certification approaches where you can almost claim that a whole sourcing region has those lower land use change emissions.
Yeah. Thanks, Megan. And I think it's a somewhat related question, maybe just worth recapping on the 20-year period rule here in response to this, but asking, I was wondering, how does LSRS handle attribution of legacy land use change emissions? Do you think this might create any kind of perverse incentive for companies that have already made progress on deforestation? The attendee acknowledges it's a tough one, but interested to hear your views on this.
Yeah, I mean, that is a tough question. So, yeah, as we've said, so any land use change event will have those emissions spread over the following 20 years. So, you're right, if you know you've taken a lot of activity or actions to reduce deforestation within your supply chain within the last 20 years, that is going to reduce your baseline and kind of like reduce the baseline from which you can prove emissions reductions. I guess on the other side, we know that like sourcing deforestation conversion free products has benefits much beyond just carbon accounting benefits. So I think, organizations that have made progress on deforestation will also see other benefits from that certification, like more resilient supply chains. And I think that kind of comes back to one of Catherine's points about, land sector removal standard accounting is one part of like your sustainability picture, but it shouldn't be the only thing that's driving those kind of decision-making processes.
That's great. Thank you, Megan. Catherine, then over to you on forestry, which is potentially a tricky one to answer, but asking which requirements do you think will be different for the forestry sector as and when that is released?
I mean, yeah, that's very difficult to say. They leave it very open. I think it's going to take some time. In the standard, there is an interim requirement for or guidance for reporting removals or emissions from adjacent and proximate lands, which I think gives probably the clearest indication for where they think they will go with how to account for those types of emissions and removals. But they leave it quite open. They caveat heavily that it is subject to change. And then in terms of how they actually come down on the side of how you can disentangle anthropogenic emissions from forestry, and guidance around allometric equations or that sort of thing potentially is honestly anyone's guess, I think.
Yeah. Is there a timeline on when they expect that to be out?
There is not. No, they've opened a consultation or are about to open a consultation. And in their original FAQ on the release of the standard, they essentially say it will be some time. And if you want to report on this in the interim, just do so transparently, not in your physical inventory, but transparently. And, I think that's one of the reasons they've given the interim guidance as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Megan, then back over to you. So for the allocation approach, can you give an example of how the area time allocation approach would be applied in practice?
Yeah, of course. So when we're thinking about area time, what we're looking to get down to is the kind of hectares time, like combination. So if you think about a single year rotation where, say, you've got 150 hectares of productive land, wheat's grown across 100 hectares for that whole year, and soy is grown across the other 50 hectares for the whole year. Wheat's got kind of 2/3 of the total area time, and soy has 1/3 of the area time. So if you were looking to capture particularly removals across that whole area. You might kind of sample all of the soil within those different fields, look at the practices that have been implemented and model that kind of stock change at the farm level. So then at the end of the year, say you've got kind of like 100 tons of removals that are expected to arise within that year, you would divide that between the soy and the wheat. So the wheat would get kind of 2/3 of the removals because it's grown on 2/3 of the area, and then the soy would just receive 1/3 of the removals.
Thanks, Megan. And I think an interesting point on that is that it therefore doesn't factor in if a particular crop, say, has additional tillage that is likely to actually be removing more soil carbon. So potatoes being a great example here, they won't be kind of penalized in that area time allocation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the key things about the stock change accounting approach is it's not necessarily down to the particular crop that's being grown on that field in that particular year, particularly when you think about like crop rotations. It's more about proving long-term increases in carbon stocks. So even if on an annual basis it might look like it's kind of wiggling, you're looking at the more kind of long-term direction of change.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. And so then, Catherine, we have a question here for you regarding intervention accounting. So can intervention accounting be used to create removals to achieve flag targets under the LSRS, or only inventory accounting allowed?
Only inventory accounting if you're reporting into your scope 3 against the LSRS, yes. They do talk quite a lot about intervention accounting in the LSRS and the standard. It comes in the standard and the guidance. It comes towards the end, and they frame it around a useful tool for decision making, and give examples of when you might want to do it and how it might help you make decisions around the types of activities you might want to undertake to reduce emissions or create removals. I think it is interesting that they spend a lot of time talking about that and talking about greenhouse gas credits and the quality criteria they'd like to see. Greenhouse gas credits are generally generated using intervention accounting. So they have a lot to say about it, but you cannot report it into your physical inventory. One of the things that they don't say about it is that, they give a lot of examples for why you might use it for decision making and that sort of thing. Our experience of people using it is because they use it where they cannot do inventory accounting or they cannot prove traceability, because there are certain situations where it's quite difficult to demonstrate that you've had impact, or to achieve that traceability. So it's used in those places or could be, and to report in different, a parallel ledger or that sort of thing. But the LSRS is silent on that use of inventory accounting.
But I think it's interesting the interplay between that and the corporate net zero version 2, because I think if we answer this question with today's guidance, you're absolutely right that you can't achieve flag targets, because flag targets currently can only be achieved based on progress within your physical GHG inventory. However, what we'd expect is with the update to the flag guidance in the coming years, it will align more with the recently released V2 corporate net zero standard that does have a bit of more flexibility, where in certain instances, and you've exhausted what you can do in your physical inventory, like you said, Catherine, because of the data traceability, some of the actions you might be taking that are accounted for through inventory approaches will be allowed to be used as some form of progress, and exactly how that's measured remains to be seen. But
completely, yeah. And I think actually even in the LSRS, the setting up of this idea of a greenhouse gas report where you report some things in the physical inventory and some things outside of it is also even teeing up for that feature.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, great. Well, we're 1 minute before the hour, and I think we've covered off all questions, so perfectly timed. So thank you all really for joining us. I hope you found today useful. We will circulate the recording on our website and also email those who've registered and send a copy of the slides. Please feel free to get in touch. You've got Catherine and Megan's email address there. You can see from today how knowledgeable they are on this topic, and we'd really encourage you to reach out if you want to continue the conversation.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.